Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it, not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences, such as...
around the time I got married, I didn't think I was doing ticking at all anymore. Then I happened to watch my wedding video, and that was the biggest mistake ever.
This is Tourette's Podcast. I'm Ben Brown. All right, off the bat, I want to give thanks to the Tourette Association of America for the really generous amount of page space they let me have in their fiscal year 2018 annual report, which I just got a copy of in the mail. The Tourette Association had given me the chance to tell my personal story in this annual report and how it led to the podcast. And of course, in doing so, that allowed me to potentially connect with other people who had never heard of the podcast before and who might benefit from this show, or at least just enjoy listening. New listeners who bring this show to a higher level. So page 17, right where the magazine opens up, if you're trying to locate the staples in the middle, that's where my column is, right in the middle on page 17. And just before it is another personal story from someone you know from season 1, Jason Grant. His story is also in here, and he's such a great writer. Just has a really clear way of describing his life with TS. Same for Brittany Wolf, who was also on season 1 here. You can read up on her story, and otherwise, this annual report, it's filled with all kinds of numbers and statistics, financials. One number here says 451 total TAA-funded research projects across 16 countries. And you can find this full report online. Again, it's the Tourette Association of America, and we have lots of listeners outside of the US. I realize that, but it's still relevant and worth reading. I'll throw that link in the show notes with this episode at tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. And if it sounds like I'm getting sick or you can hear something in my voice, true story. Anyway, huge amount of feedback about last week's episode with Eliana, who was the first non-adult Touretteer we've heard from. Here anyway, on this podcast. People in the Facebook group were just stoked at her fluency and outlook. Obviously, I was too. Please go back and listen if you haven't already. That was episode 3 of season 3. Eliana is the guest. Now, in that episode, we had a question from Jennifer. To briefly recap, she has, and I apologize in advance, Jennifer, because the whole thing with this tic is that the mention of it, or the sight of it, or even the thought of it causes her to tic. So apologies. We're talking about this coughing tic that she has. Jennifer pretty much can't even think about coughing without rousing her coughing tic. Took her a lot of strength to write in and ask whether anybody else deals with the same thing. And we got some answers. Generally, yes. A lot of other people have a tic that's kind of modeled after a common thing that also happens to be triggered by the thought of that common thing. Coughing, in this case. So a listener named Rachel wrote in and says this. Hi, Ben. I was listening to the Tourette's podcast and thought I'd let you know that I have similar triggers for some of my tics as Jennifer. I have a clapping tic that is triggered often by others clapping, as well as things that make me think about clapping specifically. Even certain songs that involve clapping can trigger clapping tics for me, and the exact rhythm in which they occur in the song. Think the Friends theme song, or Deep in the Heart of Texas. Even writing this email, I've clapped at least 20 times, and to type this email at all, I've had to clench the muscles in my hands to suppress my clapping tics. I hope this helps, and feel free to share it however and with whomever you think would find it helpful. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you, Rachel. Yvette. Hey, Yvette, good to hear from you. She says, I just started listening to season 3, episode 3, and Jennifer's question about specific triggers for tics so closely described my experience that I had to share. For me, it's a snorting tic, like the sound some people make when laughing super hard. If I even hear or read the word snort, it triggers the tic. Hearing the noise or one like it, even just on television or in a YouTube video, causes me to do it. End quote. And Yvette goes on to say, what an interesting question, Jennifer. The entire time I was listening to it, I was nodding and thinking that you could have been describing my tic. End quote. Thanks, Yvette, and everybody else who wrote in. One more from the listener mailbag. Actually got 3 emails saying similar things. And this one comes from someone we've heard from before by the name of Luana. And remember the intro from last week about evolving my parameters for this show and, not wanting to have any requirements that you be diagnosed. in order to be interviewed on this podcast. I don't want diagnosis to be the criteria for people who would like to appear on this show because not everybody has access or easy access to a diagnosis. Well, here's what Luana says. Quote, I wanted to say thank you so much for that introduction. I don't have access to a diagnosis where I live because of how expensive it would be and how hard it would be to find someone who's knowledgeable about it. And it makes me feel like I have no right to claim it at times. I found out Tourette's existed only last year, after living with it for most of my life, without knowing what to make of it. And it was such a relief. Just being able to understand what was going on got me out of a tic crisis that was causing a lot of pain, because it took so much weight off my shoulders. I felt so happy after having been stressed and worried for weeks. I've had to figure out a lot of things on my own since the end of last year, and I love that I can talk to other people that go through similar things now. And still, with all of that, I feel like I can't quite come up to someone and say I have it because I don't have a diagnosis to back it up, at least in person. I've started to let go of that feeling online after writing about it to a newsletter and saying it publicly. I plan to write about it on my blog for TS Awareness Day and have been worried at times about how to justify it in the post, since self-diagnosis isn't a great idea in so many other cases. But just hearing from someone else that it's okay to know it by yourself without the diagnosis means a lot. Thank you. End quote. Thank you, Luana, who, by the way, also told me that she has the same tic dynamics we discussed with Jennifer. So lots of people writing in about that. Luana, thanks. I know some other people are waiting on a reply from me. Maybe you've emailed me. I'm definitely catching up to it, and I've definitely read it, and I'll be in touch. Lastly, I want to say thank you to the people who chose to support the podcast financially and offset some of the costs and resource needs. I set up a Patreon page. It's patreon.com/Tourette's podcast. That's where, if you want, totally voluntary, you can contribute small monthly payments of either $5, $7, or $10, like $5 a month if you want. And it really does help. I don't want to do commercials or sponsorships or anything like that. I'd rather just let people decide if this is something they want to get behind. There is a lot that goes into this podcast, and so the support like this is amazing. Never expected, never even asked for, but greatly appreciated. Patreon.com/Tourette's podcast. Okay, let's get to our conversation this week. Love this one. We're going to talk with Akiva. He's a rabbi and a teacher and a really warm person with a totally interesting backstory, actually, with Tourette Syndrome that I will not delay. Here's me talking with Akiva.
So my name is Akiva Hall, and I live in Biloxi, Mississippi, if anyone knows where that is.
Mm-hmm.
And I am a rabbi and a teacher for third grade boys.
So when we first touched base over email, you had told me that you had kind of an unusual history with Tourette's, and that's true. It really is an interesting story. I think it picks up with you recalling that you've had tics as early as you can remember. How does this story kind of begin for you?
So here's, as far as I remember, based on what my family can kind of fill in, is that my family and I both kind of agree that from the very beginning, my mother said, she passed away years ago, but according to her memory, according to my father's memory, since the very beginning, since I was a toddler, I had one specific tic that really stood out from the beginning, which was a kind of a neck, like turning my head like to the side, kind of, of a tic, which I think is a very common tic. And that is, as far as I know, probably the first and most noticeable and most constant tic, and I've heard that I was doing that forever. And then somewhere, and I'm not consciously aware of doing that when I was that young. When it became kind of in my consciousness was, I think I was around 11 and 12, 10, 11, 12, that kind of range. I remember distinctly that starting to first develop a lot of kind of OCD traits that have mostly gone away. But I mean, in retrospect, like very, like not like having a neat room, like, hand washing and counting and touching things and those kinds of things. And those have mostly all gone away. But and then at that same time, I began sniffing and doing a bunch of eye tics and humming for a while, like a low kind of hum. And then at some point, my mother, who was a very educated and she watched a lot of Oprah, and she was a very worldly kind of person. Yeah. She kind of, I don't know if she saw a special or she saw something, that she kind of decided on her own, like, oh, this looks like all these things you've been doing. This looks like you probably have Tourette's. I didn't know what that was, but
Huh.
she told it about me and said, this is probably what you have. Interestingly enough, I think I was always kind of a weird kid, but I think I hid a lot of my OCD stuff from my parents.
Sure.
And I
Yeah.
was 10 still. I was a little kid, but I think I hid a lot of that from my parents. And I know that they thought I was obsessed with, random things, but I don't think they ever, even to this day, probably, I mean, not, know the extent of that. And that really was the majority of what was giving me the trouble. The tics were noticeable, but never really gave me that much, trouble. So my mother never, at least as far as I remember, she's passed away, since then. I don't think that you should ever take it to a school, or a hospital, to a specialist, a neurologist, or anything. So I just kind of grew up from the time I was 10, like kind of always assuming that
Right.
all these tics that I have, that's called Tourette's, and I kind of moved on from it. Which I guess is lucky because a lot of kids don't even know what in the world it is, and the parents don't even know.
So mentioning hiding some of your behavior from your parents, do you remember why you were hiding it? Was it just because of the sort of unusual nature of it, or?
So I think that I knew it was crazy.
Okay.
I wasn't. This is a long time ago, and a
Yeah.
lot of that went away. I do still, I'm cognizant of certain things that I do and certain mindsets that I have that I could probably talk about, later. But it was, very weird, having, thoughts, if I don't tap my foot on the street a certain number of times, then something terrible would happen.
Mm-hmm.
I was very close to my mother, so a lot of these things were connected to her, that if something terrible would happen to her if I didn't tap my foot 10 times on the street, or if I didn't count to 30 when I'm squirting the soap, those kinds of things. I knew they're insane, and so I don't want to talk to my parents about weird things that I'm doing.
Right.
And I don't think it was debilitating enough that I couldn't function, because I always was, doing okay in school and things. But it was something that I didn't feel like I wanted to share for whatever reason.
What about so this was roughly when you were 10 to 13 years old, roughly,
Yeah,
is that right?
I think so.
What about the kids around you? Were they picking up on things and asking you questions, or?
So I think, like, from the very beginning, my most noticeable tic always, until relatively recently, was, so the OCD I kept totally secret, basically.
Okay.
It could be a secret. The most noticeable tics, I never had noticeable vocal tics. Well, a little bit. There was a time during this time when I would hum. When I was a kid, I did that a lot, like a lot of, like, and that kind of thing, which I haven't done in ages, since I was probably 10.
Huh.
But people noticed that a lot, and I don't even know if I said anything or what I said. And then as far as, like, my eye tics or head jerking or those kinds of things, I always just kind of said, this is just something that I do. I don't remember until high school actually saying that, well, I think this is Tourette's. I just kind of said, this is just something I do. And it was never drastic enough that it interrupted classes or those kinds of things.
Sure. But so going back to that episode of Oprah that your mom was watching, and she was able
I think
to
that's what it was. I don't remember for sure. I could have been multiple things, but that's what I think happened.
But so she at least had some source of information where she was able to kind of deduce that you might have Tourette syndrome.
And I'm sure she looked online also. She was a very kind of studious kind of person to find out things. She was that kind of person. She probably researched online also.
So do you remember if there was a conversation about following it up with a trip to the neurologist or doctor, or just sort of where did it go from there?
I don't remember, and I think that there's a lot of memories from this time that I just don't remember.
Yeah.
I think probably because I never expressed, like, a discomfort from it. I don't think that she, probably didn't feel it was something I had to. I don't know. That's the way I could think of it. I just didn't express that it was bothering me necessarily.
So things kind of alleviated. Is that right, or things kind of cooled out for you, or what happened over the next few years?
As far as going into middle school and high school, I think the OCD kind of peaked around the age of 13 or so, and then it went away to a huge degree.
Okay.
And until today. That kind of aspect of it. Sometimes I'll catch myself, like, for example, today. For example, today I went with I went to an art museum today with my family. Like
Mm-hmm.
in my head, I get very anxious if we don't go to every room and see everything and go in the order that the museum is designed. And then I
Yeah,
realized,
yeah,
okay, I'm gonna not go down that line of thought, and I'm just gonna ignore it because I know that's ridiculous, and I know what it is, and I'm not gonna do it. And I didn't do it, but I'll find that sometimes coming back in my brain, but I'll like kind of actively say, well, I'm not gonna do that. It's ridiculous.
yeah, yeah.
So I mean, there's very, very, very few things that OCD wise, you know, that pick up. I mean, like little things like I do in my profession and my life. I do a lot of reading, and I have glasses because I don't have very good eyesight. So I'm like obsessive about my glasses. So when I take them off at night, I have to put them down very specifically in a certain place in a certain way, and it has to be,
Mm-hmm.
feel right. And those, but that's only like very certain things.
Right.
But the OCD aspect really went away, when I was 13 or so. But the ticks
So the
stayed,
tick stuck around
and
in high school.
they stuck around. Yeah, they stuck around,
Okay.
and they changed, I guess, in type or frequency, but they stuck around.
Yeah, changing in frequency. What were you picking up, and how were you kind of managing these ticks? I mean, were they severe enough to where they were, they were very conspicuous, or what was it like?
So I don't really know. I know I've always done them. I'll give you an example from more recent times.
Sure.
Jumping ahead a little bit. Around the time that I got married, well, I'll just go in order, and I'll say. So I think it always kind of maintained the same level, the same type of tics. Coughing and like body tenses were very still something I do. Like I think one of the guests said very similar. One of your guests actually, I don't remember what his name was. One person you had recently, literally his Tourette sounds exactly like mine, like in every aspect.
Hmm.
Not too extreme, not too this, but the same type of tics. I was very surprised by that. But I think like body tensing, like clenching my shoulders or my abdomen or my eyelid, like my eyes when they're closed, even, which was the only tic that was ever kind of painful. So those things all, sniffing, those things, head twitch, that was a big one. Those all stuck around and kind of, I guess, maintained the same level. But then I think I would forget about it, and then I would only be realized later that I was doing it. Like around the time I got married, I didn't think I was doing ticking at all anymore.
Yeah.
Then I happened to watch my wedding video, and that was the biggest mistake ever because I literally, the entire video, all I'm doing is ticking.
Huh.
And I
Yeah.
thought that I don't tick anymore. I thought like, okay, I guess I'm over it. And then I watched the video, and I'm like ticking the entire time.
Wow. So it's stuff that you weren't aware that you were doing at the time. You watched the video, you see yourself
Yeah,
ticking.
yeah. And I guess like some ticks I feel an urge to do it, and others I just don't. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm the same way.
so that was very surprising to me and kind of upsetting. But I kind of had a change of, I think part of like finding the podcast, even why I was looking for it in the first place, or how I happened upon it, was because I kind of had a change of mindset a little bit.
Oh, okay. So is that a change from? I mean, so were you talking about it kind of openly before, or was this just something you just kind of shut away in terms of public discussion?
So in high school, so all through middle school and high school, it always just is kind of how I explained it, kind of just subtle, but
Mm-hmm.
there, and people would comment on it.
Yeah.
And I would just kind of shrug it off and say, like, well, it's just something I do, whatever. It's not such a big deal. And then, like high school, I think I just started becoming. I'm a very studious person. I like to learn,
Mm-hmm.
and so
Yeah.
in high school, I just practically began learning about what it is, what Tourette's is, and really identifying with it, and realizing like, well, that really is, that's really me, and I became more knowledgeable about it. So then I could like tell people, this is what it is.
Right.
But I didn't think it was a big deal, really. It didn't really impact my life until, and also, by the way, interesting. I don't know. I never read anything about this really. I don't know if it's because in the Jewish world we do a lot of traveling. Like people, like boys go to school in different. I was raised in New Orleans, but I went to school in Los Angeles. I went to school in New York, like with other boys from all over the country. Like you meet a lot of different people during your years of like post high school. So I don't know if that's part of it or whatever, but like during my life, I've met 5 or 6 or 7 like of my contemporaries who also exhibited very clear signs of Tourette's.
Huh.
I never spoke about it with any of them before. I don't know why, but I never thought to broach the subject. But I've encountered many people, 5 or 6 people I can think of in the last couple, 10 years who I could certainly say, have the same have the same thing. But I just kind of went through life with it, and then until the incident I mentioned to you in my email, that was when it really started to become something that was bothersome to me.
Yeah. So you had mentioned that in the Orthodox Jewish world, there are standards to dating, and Tourette's kind of came into play with
So
that.
yeah, exactly. So basically, yeah, like you mentioned in the in the Jewish world, Orthodox world, when a boy and girl are ready to date around the ages of 20 or 21 or so, our parents make for us a resume, like a job
Hmm.
resume, basically,
Right.
with your interests and your background and your personality. And they like send them off to like other families or professionals who do it for a living, try to pair up people. And then when they find two resumes that look good, then they set you up on a date. Then you go on the date, and then if you like it, then you continue. If you don't, then you call it off. So my mother had passed away when I was 18,
Hmm.
so she wasn't directly involved in this. So my father asked our family's rabbi's wife, who was like a big matriarch in the community, to kind of oversee my resume. It's like a woman's kind of department to make a resume about emotions and these kinds of things,
Huh, okay.
because they know what the girls are looking for and they want to make it look good. So he was working on this, and then I came home I was in yeshiva in rabbinical school. I came home for a holiday, and this is like in the process that we're looking, I'm going to start dating soon. So she's like watching me and making sure my shirt's tucked in and all these kinds of things. And then we actually have a holiday called Shavuos where we stay up all night.
Hmm.
So when I'm tired and not sleeping, I tick very bad, much more
Yeah.
noticeable, as most people do, I think.
Yeah. Me too.
So the next morning, everybody in the community was sitting like after services. We have like a big lunch, and I guess she was watching me especially because afterwards she said, and everyone knew I always had tics and twitches and things, but she said, I was watching you today, and your twitches were so noticeable and so
Huh.
obvious. I think this is a big problem.
Huh.
And she's not
Yeah.
a prejudiced or a mean lady, but she's like,
Right.
we have to know what this is. Like, why are you doing this? We have to figure it out. And she said, why are you doing this? So I said, based on what my mother thought when I was a kid, I think I have Tourette's. So she never heard of it before. So she went online and she called me back and maybe called my father, freaking out. Like, this is unbelievable.
Oh,
This is a
wow.
major disease and cursing. You have to go to a psychologist right away. I'm not going to make the resume until you go to a psychologist,
Wow.
because a girl is not going to a family isn't
Yeah.
going to want to marry you if you have some kind of a disease or something. So I was freaking out.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
and this isn't meant to reflect badly on her or the system. It's a very good system.
Sure.
She
Yeah.
just happened to not So she set me up with a psychologist, which is not, the proper
Hmm.
person to speak with for something like this. And he was an older guy, also kind of an older person. And he said, so Mrs. Rifkin, which is her name, thinks you think you have Tourette's. Okay. Do you swear? And so I said no. And he said, okay, so I don't think you have Tourette's. So I think you just
Uh,
have a nervous twitch. So
yeah.
all
Yeah.
good. So listen, I knew he was wrong. I knew,
Yeah.
because I'm an intelligent person and I did my own research. I knew he's full of it.
Right.
But I said, okay, great, because then I could call back Mrs. Rifkin and tell her, look, I don't have Tourette's. I'm fine. Just a twitch. Let's get married. So she said, okay, very good. So she made me a resume, and then
Huh.
I met my wife actually a couple months later.
Wow.
Very strange
Oh,
story,
man.
but
That's amazing though. I
it's
mean,
very strange.
so I've asked too, when you were going through the process of becoming a rabbi, did this kind of enter into that in any way?
I'm not really. I mean,
Okay.
it's
I apologize if that's
no
an
more
ignorant
so than it.
question. I
No,
just
not at all.
curious.
Just no, not at all. You're saying at the time, like I was going through school.
Yeah,
You mean?
yeah. Or was that observed and seen as any sort of
I
concern to
mean,
the
I
same
think
degree?
no
Or
concern. Again, I don't know if this is a statistic, but there's. I mean, I can't imagine that of all the Orthodox Jewish people I know in the world is not a very huge number, and
Mhm.
for a good number of them to have noticeable tics is pretty unusual. So I
Yeah.
kind of get this feeling that these kinds of things, if it's not very noticeable or very disruptive, people just kind of ignore it. I don't know if there's any connection behind that or not, but
Huh.
no, I mean, other than kind of this level that the tics have maintained, know. And I think the truth is that I was always, I think ironically, usually it's the opposite way, that the person feels more self-conscious than the onlookers. I think in this case, I was less aware of it than other people were.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah.
I didn't think, for example, when I spoke to my wife about it later, I didn't think I did it anymore hardly. Maybe a couple shoulder shrugs here and there. Oh, I noticed it on the second date. Yeah, like, I didn't think it was noticeable. So I assume that's always been that way. People just think I'm a twitchy, person.
So upon your marriage, your wife does or doesn't know at that point?
So she didn't know. So she certainly knew I had tics.
Yeah.
So the tics I have, I didn't keep a journal or anything through my life. So I don't really know what what tics have stuck around the longest or not. But like these, I don't know if the tics I have now are the tics I had 5 years ago. I know that there were certain tics that I had at certain like parts of my life,
right,
that were very like memorable that I may or may not do now. Yeah, but she certainly noticed the tics right away, and she didn't say anything about them. But then, like periodically, she would mention them, and I would get very offended.
Yeah.
I would get very not offended. It's stupid to say offended, but I would get very embarrassed, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
Like oh, I can tell you're really stressed because you're really twitching a lot, tonight, or like those kinds of things, or like or like I do a lot, and I don't really know the mechanisms behind it. I do a lot of clearing my throat, like all day.
Right. Yeah.
But to me, also, it doesn't like. I don't know. This is, I'm sure, neurological in some way, but it's not just like I just do it. But I feel like there's a physical reason for me to. I feel like there's something in my throat, and then
right.
I don't know if that's a common feeling. I don't just like. It feels like I'm clearing my throat, but I don't really think that a normal person clears their throat all day, every day.
Yeah, I think about that. Yeah.
I think to myself, oh, I have something in my throat that I need to cough to alleviate that feeling. But I think that's a tit. I don't think that there's actually something. So my wife like mentions like coughing, and I just say, oh, there's something in my throat, something in my throat. And it's not, it just happens all the time. And whenever I cough, I also usually sniff also.
Well, that's a really good analogy for the sort of, at least for some of the tics I have, because I feel the same thing. I feel like there is some, even if I can't identify what it is, I feel like there's a practical reason for me to tic in a lot of cases, just for that feeling of satisfaction you get at the end of it when you actually do it right.
Yeah.
And I clear my throat all day when I'm at work. And I think the exact same thing you think, that there's no way I need to clear my throat this much. But when I'm doing it,
it feels like
it feels like there's a purpose for it. I'll clear my throat and everything's fine. Then I'll clear it again, 5 seconds later, without really having the thought, like I need to clear my throat. It just kind of happens like my body's on autopilot.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that with a lot of tics I have, and I think even so when I'm in a situation where they're kind of flaring up too, like or being tired, as you mentioned. I mean, they definitely pick up a lot at those times. In the early days with your wife, were there sort of because you mentioned the word embarrassment, did that kind of flare up your tics, being kind of self-conscious of them, or?
I'm sure it did. I don't remember explicitly. I'm sure it did, but it was embarrassed, I guess, because I think when I went away to school when I was 18, I went away from home to school for 4 years, and I just kind of like, even though like in high school I like learned a lot about Tourette's and would talk to people about it a little bit.
Yeah.
I think when I went away to school, I think like you kind of reinvent yourself. You go to college, you go away from home. So I kind of just didn't want to talk about it. That's probably why I didn't. Probably a mistake. I didn't try to initiate a conversation with some of the other boys who I, over the years who probably also had Tourette's. I just kind of wanted to just not talk about it anymore, I think. Even though in my mind, if I didn't want to talk about it, I probably wasn't doing it, but really I was. And then I think when I got married, the same thing, especially, watching my wedding video, which is very embarrassing for me, and going through this thing from the resume was very embarrassing for me.
Yeah.
So I just kind of didn't want to talk about it anymore. And then my wife, whenever she'd bring it up, that would be very embarrassing to me, because I was kind of in that mindset of, well, I've moved on. I don't really need to discuss this anymore. Let's move on.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I was probably feeling those years until relatively recently.
Yeah. So, you might have to reiterate a little bit, but what was it that that kind of moved in you that that kind of changed your mind?
Well, a couple of things happened kind of concurrently. First of all, I have a daughter, a 5-year-old daughter,
Hmm.
and she began exhibiting very noticeable tics.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so which is nothing, it's still, I don't think she even hardly notices them, nothing crazy. The same exact tics that I had or have had. And at that point, it became like the elephant in the room. Like my wife sees her doing it and I see her doing it. And
Yeah.
okay, so we probably should talk about what this is.
Right.
So then I kind of started to get back into researching a little bit and talking to my wife about it. And I think just kind of it morphed into more of a like, well, listen, this is clearly something which is not so devastating, in the realm. I remember it's very interesting. I think some of the people that you spoke to in the interviews mentioned like when they first started having a tic, or they remember their first day of having a tic. So I don't remember that
Hmm.
myself, but we did notice very clearly when my daughter started to have tics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she had when she was 4 still, she started a cough, like a kind of a Tourette kind of cough.
Hmm.
And it went away after a couple of weeks. And I know a lot of kids do develop, kind of transient tics. So okay, no big deal. And then like one night at dinner, she started this, very noticeable kind of head tic, the same one that I would do. And when she was doing it like nonstop, all night. My wife was like was getting very nervous. And then it kind of calmed down, but it didn't stop since then. And that was almost a year ago. So it was like it like started like
Yeah.
boom, it's just like there it is.
Huh.
And I think like this is my daughter, and if you have if you have to own it. Okay, so this is something which is real and something that I have and something that she has. Then let's be proud of it, and let's be it's who I am, it's what I do, it's nothing to be ashamed of. And I felt like it would be irresponsible for her and my daughter and my wife if I'm embarrassed of it.
Right. Okay.
So I think that kind of changed my perception. And that happened about a year ago that I really started feeling that way. And I watched a couple documentaries and I did some reading, and I didn't want to show my wife any of that stuff because I don't want her to see a bunch of kids, yelling out all kinds of words, because I don't think that hopefully that's not the kind of experience my daughter will have with it.
Hmm.
So I didn't want to show my wife any of that stuff because it's
Right.
scary. I mean, 'cause I didn't have any of that kind of thing. But so in that process, I think organically I kind of stumbled upon the podcast. That's what led to that, I think. And along with this was the thought, if and my wife said at a certain point, if my daughter continues doing this, it will probably go to a neurologist. So then I was
Yeah.
thinking maybe I should go to a neurologist. So I was never formally diagnosed. But then I thought to myself that I don't really know if there's a purpose in me doing that,
Sure.
because I certainly don't need any medication. So I don't really know what the purpose of me personally getting a formal diagnosis would be, if it's worth the trouble or the effort. But for my daughter, I think that we probably will pursue that, in the future.
Sure. Yeah.
And then I might get an automatic diagnosis.
Yeah. I mean,
For the same
that's
price,
true.
the price of one.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense what you said about what your experience is. You kind of know where you are with it, and you're not labored to the point where you feel like there needs to be any sort of intervention. Obviously, it does make sense to monitor your daughter and kind of make sure she has all the resources she needs. But at the same time, too, just the fact that you're able to help, you can walk her through it on a family, on a personal level, and you've self-accepted, you can set that tone for her. I mean, I think that's a really kind of great outcome in the making.
Well, thank you. I hope so.
So what else has changed in the past year, just in terms of what you've learned or things that have made an impression on you?
So that's a good question. I mean, nothing probably too much on the outside, other than my, behavior and meaning like my mental, state, how I think of it, One thing that has happened that I think is that now I'm like hyper aware of my tics. And I whereas like in the past, because I was kind of pretending it wasn't something that I had to think about anymore, it
Yeah.
kind of like melded into the back. I mean, not entirely. For example, I'm a teacher also. So I actually teach on a computer online,
Okay.
a virtual classroom. I teach every day third grade boys who live all over the country, and I teach them like it's a program called Blackboard Collaborate, where you can see all the kids together, and they can raise their hand, and they can have mic permission and have private pages.
Hmm.
It's like a virtual classroom.
Yeah.
So I remember, like in years, even before I kind of came to this realization that I should be more open about it. I remember like days where I had to, turn off my camera for a minute because I was doing like a really big head tick or,
Hmm.
those kinds of things. So I do like remember certain, tick incidents, but they were just kind of in the background. But then like now, because I'm like cognizant of it because of my daughter and because of my new mindset, I'm like more aware. So I don't always know, like, is this a tick I've had forever? Is this a new tick? And some of them interesting. I'll like do a tick, and I like have this like physical memory of doing this when I was a kid.
Hmm.
Like I wasn't cognizant of all these years I was doing it, but now that I'm thinking about it consciously, I'm kind of brought back to doing this as a kid, which is interesting.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
don't know if all these ticks I have now, they've always been there. Have not been a new tick. I have no idea.
Huh.
And that's kind of come from like a more conscious recognition of it, which I don't know if that's good or bad. It's just what it is.
Are there any big, I guess, questions hanging out there for you that you're trying to answer in terms of, I guess, learning more about Tourette's? And I mean, you're the expert on your own experiences in life, but are there any questions that you're trying to answer or anything you want to know?
That's a really great thing to ask. Yeah, probably. Yeah, I think so. First of all, I mean, this is, in your opinion, do you think that someone? So I'll give you the example exactly. So every summer and winter, we go to visit my in-laws who live in Los Angeles. And in my in-laws community, like in like the synagogue that we all pray at in Los Angeles, there's another guy younger than me. I'm 29. This guy is probably, I don't know, 22 or something,
Mm-hmm.
and very noticeable. Not like extremely. I mean, you wouldn't notice it unless you probably know what you're looking for. But like,
Mm-hmm.
very noticeably, ticking. The whole gamut of ticks.
Right.
So every time I go there, I always toy with the idea. Like maybe I should, say hello to him, or maybe I should mention something. And I never did. I don't know if that's normal or not normal. I have no idea. I mean, do you
Yeah.
think it would be everyone's different, of course, but I mean, do you think it would be in your experience, a strange thing or a nice thing? Like, what do you think about that?
I never really did that. I never really, there was one time I did just kind of say hey to somebody, but that was it. It was just, I didn't make myself significant to them in any other way. I think I was just kind of nervous about it because just in my own experience, I wasn't really open,
Just talking about it
yeah, I just
so much.
didn't really have much experience talking about it because I just didn't want to tell people. Even to this day, it's funny because I've been doing this podcast for a little more than a year now, and been doing a lot of work in the interim trying to connect with the community. But I still haven't talked with anybody else in person who has Tourette syndrome in my
Really,
adult life.
really.
Yeah, it's still yet to
Wow.
happen. It's all been over the phone and conversations like this.
Interesting.
But what you said earlier about being kind of heightened to it and kind of knowing what to look for, I'm sort of always doing that now. I think
Yeah.
with the hope that I will see someone who seems to be approachable and he knows what I'm talking about and I know what he's talking about, or he or she or whoever. I got to retract one thing though. So in episode 0 of season 1, I talked with somebody else who I meet on the street who has Tourette syndrome.
I listened to that one. Yeah.
Yeah, but
I
it's
remember
like I had no idea that this is just a
That was
random
just
person I
random.
stopped on the street and said like, hey, do you know what Tourette syndrome is? And this guy's like, I have it. So that is the one time I've talked with
Interesting.
somebody else for as brief as that was. But I am still waiting on the opportunity, I guess, if that's the right word, to just kind of meet somebody cold who I feel like I can relate to.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's a very good answer. It's a good answer because I always, even before I started kind of changing my mindset. We already have other things in common. I don't know this person at all, but we similar backgrounds, and so
Yeah.
it's not like a stranger on the street. We already have a minimal connection,
Right.
just through both
Yeah.
being Orthodox Jews and going to the same synagogue and living, so it's not weird. Like, oh, I saw you on the street, and it's not. It already is one level less weird.
Yeah, yeah.
But I always thought should I say hello? Should I mention? I don't even know what I would say. I thought one time I'm gonna do it, and I decided no, it's weird. I didn't, and maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it would be a nice thing.
Yeah, that's my thing.
So,
I think I wouldn't exactly know how to do it in a way that even if I do present myself as someone who has Tourette syndrome, I still feel like it would be a little bit weird or odd or something, that I'm just kind of a guy coming out of the blue saying, hey, I think I have what you have too. And I know at the same time, everybody's personal business is everybody's personal business. And I think at the same time, I could easily see myself talking myself out of approaching somebody else.
Yeah, which I've done. Yeah.
And I think that's, I have a lot of social anxiety in that regard when it comes to just kind of even ordering a cup of coffee at the coffee shop. I feel like I have anxiety about my presentation and what I say, even though it's the simplest thing in the world.
And even though that your tics probably aren't very noticeable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of
They'll never know. They won't notice it. They won't say anything. It's just that sort of part of my brain that just sort of inflames and stokes the anxiety part of it. And
sure.
So it's funny. I'm kind of changing my answer in progress now that I'm thinking more about it. But I want to talk to somebody in person. I have that want. I don't know if I could call it a need, but I definitely want to.
You don't participate in the walks or the runs or the marathons or those kinds of fundraising things?
It's funny because all that stuff is still somewhat new to me. And and so I've been, signing up for newsletters and all that just to kind of see what's happening in my area. And I've had some brief conversations with the Tourette Association people or at least the community support people in my state. I think it's also been kind of a thing of scheduling conflicts and things like that.
Just
where there's something I'd like to
practicality.
Yeah, just there are plenty of opportunities I'd love to participate in, but just haven't yet. But 2019 is going to be my year because I've already signed up for a couple things. And I'm looking forward to that because that would be the first opportunity for me to
to
hang
huge
out.
Opportunity. Yeah, absolutely. It's very the more kind of exposure that I have and these things. I know you've mentioned this, and I've seen this in other sources also. I'm not really musically inclined, but I am. I mean, I think there certainly is I think there is more than just the tics to this, to Tourette's. Right. There's a personality and a kind of a, I don't know, I don't want to say a quirkiness because that could come across as kind of an insulting word to people.
Sure.
But
I know what you mean though.
It's like a personality quirkiness probably.
Yeah.
A lot of the people that, you've talked about, kind of like, unusual kids, a little bit different, a little bit more maybe nerdy or studious and more intelligent, maybe. It seems that it's kind of a underrunning current through a lot of these people's experiences that I think is very interesting.
Yeah, that's true.
There's so much about it that no one really knows that aspect at all about it.
And it kind of bears out when I, on the occasions when I ask the question, would you, if you could just eliminate Tourette's from your life, or if you could go back in time and do something that, cleared it from your body or which is a ridiculous concept, but
sure,
but would you do it? And the answer that seems to be the most popular is yeah, I would get rid of my, my painful tics, my annoying
this
tics.
tic or that. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. But it's like there's something about having Tourette syndrome that's impacted my life that I wouldn't change. And so it's always kind of that TS is way more than just tics.
It's something like there's a deeper thing at play.
Absolutely.
And that kind of brings me back to what I was saying in the beginning, that I think that the opportunity to hear and talk, especially to adults,
right, that
have, obviously, if you look at, the people that you've interviewed that I've listened to, probably, I think probably 3/4 of your podcast I listened to, these people, most of these people have, relatively what we would call, I don't really know what this means, mild or moderate or whatever that means.
Right.
But I think it's so easy. So A, you're not a kid, so you're out of that experience, and B, you're not going through anything which is, life shattering. I
Hmm.
mean, meaning I've never felt that at least that I remember, I never felt that I was, disruptive to a class and that everybody was laughing at me, or that I couldn't go on an airplane because I was going to say something. I never
Right.
felt that I was ever in that situation. So that could very easily exclude a person from feeling or kind of connecting on any level that he has. There's anything unusual about him, because you're just, well, you don't have this, so you're just a normal person, whatever. But the
Right.
truth is, no, I do a lot of unusual things, and they feel very, real and very noticeable to me. And there's no connection of what that is. So like this forum of hearing adults who are normal people who have, subtle but very big to them, but very subtle experience with Tourette's, that's kind of revolutionary, I think.
What's ahead for you in this sort of journey? I mean, it is kind of a new thing, you could say, and obviously your daughter is going to be an enormous factor in this. But
Sure.
kind of exploring this, where do you think you're going?
Um, I mean, I don't think I'm going to become an activist or anything.
Right.
I don't really. I think probably what you said is, depends how much this is going to shape my daughter, and that'll
Yeah.
be, and God willing, future kids. How this may or may not shape them, and how we respond to that. And also, you mentioned also the ability to, since I'm aware of this, that I have a connection I could make with other people who might also be going through this, and that might be a very valuable thing to someone one day. And it's just very interesting because, I really am kind of and it sounds very dramatic and very, like a Lifetime movie or something, but it's really not. But like, I feel like I'm
Yeah.
kind of like, like accepting something about myself that always was just kind of hidden away for no reason other than just my own, embarrassment, I guess. But so I think probably it feels good to like know what it is and know what's going on. And even though it might not seem so drastic to other people, to me, it's something which is very real. So just kind of going forward with that mindset, is very good. Again, it is interesting. Like I mentioned earlier, that I'm aware of it now.
Hmm.
So I'm very curious to know, like, have these tics that I have now, have these always been what I was doing all along? I just didn't always notice them, or that's just kind of a mysterious, thought to me. You know, like, you know, like I have a lot of like finger tics. Like when I'm holding my phone, like I'm talking to someone, I like, tilt the phone away, or like tilt it and move the phone a little bit, and
Yeah.
like stretch my fingers. And that's actually one of the first things you noticed from my daughter, is that like when like playing a game or doing something tactile, like moving fingers or wiggling fingers and like hand things. And
Yeah.
I only became conscious that I was doing that, was I'm wondering, was I always doing that? It's just, that's not one of the noticeable, like my head tick has always been noticeable.
Yeah.
A while, the humming tick when I was a kid was very noticeable. Uh, or like my coughing and sniffing. I don't know, maybe that blended in. I have no idea if I always been doing this, always been. It's very mysterious to me because I don't really know. And that's all kind of something that I'm trying to, discern now. I do one tick that I really don't like just because it looks stupid. And my wife has commented on it a billion times. I don't think she even knows it's a tick. I don't know what else it could be,
Right.
but I it's stupid to me. A lot of my tics are like inside tics, like, abdomen kind of tensing or
Yeah.
shoulders tensing. A lot of that at
Absolutely.
night. Also with you, really.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Especially the stomach tensing thing, and I feel like I hear that one from a fair number of people I've talked to, but that's a really historic one with me is stomach tensing.
So that's not noticeable to anybody,
Right.
but that's probably the tick that I do the most often.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that, like this kind of tensing, and it just happens. Sometimes I'm aware of it before it happens, and then sometimes I'm only aware of it when it happens.
Right.
But that's like constant. And I think I used to have a lot more, and I know like when I was 17, 18, I had a lot of eye tics, like rolling my eyes up, or like sometimes today I'll still do like opening my eyes wide or something. I do some of that still,
Right.
but it
Oh,
was, so
yeah.
when
Yeah.
so I don't, but like this one, I don't know what it is. I pass my fingers over my lips, and then I put my fingers like on my nose and I sniff. So it
Hmm.
looks like I'm smelling my fingers, but I'm not. So my wife says, "Oh, why do you always smell your fingers? Why do you always
Yeah.
rub your? Why do you always?" rub your finger on your lip. Why are you smelling your lips? Why are you smelling your fingers? It's very embarrassing.
Yeah.
And she meant like all through our marriage, why do you do that all the time? And so I would like hide it. And then I realized like, well, I think that's probably a tic because I don't know why else I would be doing that. And I just catch myself doing it all the time. If I don't do it, I feel like an urge to do it usually. I don't think she's even aware that that's a tic, because it's not, a cough or a, eye thing. It's like a very unusual kind of a thing. And so that, like, I could do without that, and that's not worth medication though. It's not worth becoming a robot. So,
Thanks so much for listening. Thanks to Akiva for being a truly memorable guest and also just enjoyable to talk to. To make this a wider conversation, please weigh in. What do you think about Akiva's story? And what about it do you find relatable? Tourette'sPodcast@gmail.com, Tourette's Podcast discussion group on Facebook, @Tourette'sPod on Twitter. Questions, comments, suggestions, or just say hi. Patreon.com/Tourette'sPodcast if you want to become a contributor to the show. Again, thank you so much to the people who've already signed on to do that. It makes a huge amount of difference. Again, this podcast is always going to be free, always going to be a free resource, even if nobody backs it, because part of the point is outreach and making connections and feeling less isolated. But your support does end up being pretty meaningful to a lot of people who enjoy listening or find an actual benefit from listening to the podcast. All right, gotta run because, like I said, I'm totally coming down with something. My wife and I are both sick, so I'm gonna rest up, but let's talk in the meantime. Thanks again for listening. This is Ben.